So Chavi, I think, are you kicking us off?
Yes, yeah, I just keep seeing the numbers go up, so I was going to give all the attendees a minute, but hello and welcome to the first event in the ConTech Scholarly API series. My name is Chavi Chauhan, and I'm Director of Scientific Outreach at American Society for Scholarly Publishing, where we publish a couple of journals. Today, we have with us a very eclectic panel that will focus on scholarly APIs, application programming interfaces, the current and future value of APIs. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like the attendees to share in chat where they're joining in from and what they expect from this session so that we can cater better to your needs. And we have our speakers from Canada, East Coast, West Coast, all over the world. So since we only have 60 minutes to cover huge ground, let us get started with introductions. Maria, would you like to go first?
Yes, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from today. I'm very happy to be here and to be part of this panel. So I'm based at California Digital Library, which is part of the system-wide libraries at the University of California in the United States. And at CDL, I'm responsible for a portfolio of persistent identifier services. And this work includes running the Research Organization Registry, which is also known as ROR. And ROR is an open registry of identifiers and metadata for institutional affiliations in research. ROR is really designed to work with other identifiers like DOIs and ORCIDs, and we have an open API that is used to disambiguate and standardize institution names in scholarly metadata. So we spend a lot of time at ROR working with users who are interested in integrating ROR in various research and scholarly publishing systems and connecting them to other identifiers. And so all of that work really depends on various APIs working well together. I'm personally trained as a librarian, and my background is in scholarly publishing and scholarly communications. I didn't really do anything with APIs until I started working on identifier services, and I really care a lot about helping non-technical scholarly communication professionals like myself work with APIs and identifiers because they can be such powerful tools, and especially really powerful in furthering open research and publishing. So very happy to be part of this session today.
We're so happy to have you. I think we're going to have a bunch of questions coming your way, but let's go through the introductions. Nikki, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. So I'm Nikki Pfeiffer, the Chief Product Officer at the Center for Open Science, which is a nonprofit mission-driven organization. Our mission is to increase the openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. I've been at the center for about a little over 7 years. And I work on the development of our open source infrastructure, which is called the Open Science Framework, or OSF, which is built to support researchers in conducting open science practices.
Wonderful. Welcome to the session. Lisa, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. And I'm really excited to see all of the comments that are coming through in the chat, and hope we'll be able to meet these expectations and also hear good questions from everyone. It seems like there's a lot of good experience too. So I'm Lisa Janicki Hinchliff. I'm the professor as well as the coordinator for research and teaching professional development at the University Library at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In particular, I think my kind of hat I'm wearing here as somebody whose scholarship focuses on looking at what is happening in scholarly publishing, particularly across the industry, looking at open access and different ways that libraries are contracting for things. So I'm always excited to see how the industry, as well as libraries and researchers, are working to improve the research publication ecosystem. And it seems to me as I look out that APIs are both something that is really helping a lot with this, as well as really isn't used as sort of robustly as I think we'll see it be used as we build our capacity as a collective community. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for including me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure to have you, Lisa. And we'll call upon you wearing this librarian hat today on multiple occasions. But last but not the least, we have with us Dominic. Would you like to introduce yourself, Dominic?
Yeah, sure. Hello, I'm Dom, and I work on scite, which if you don't know what it is, it's a platform for discovery of citation statements, so essentially the text around citations. And we also do a lot of stuff around determining whether papers reproduce one another or support or dispute or surfacing criticism and so on. And primarily, I'm a software developer and a natural language processing researcher. So I think I probably fall into the API user and builder category. And yeah.
Wonderful. Welcome, Dominic. So we have researchers here, we have scholars, we have librarians, people using APIs, people who would like to enable the use of API. I quickly want to run through the very happening chat that we have this morning when we have attendees coming in from UK, Japan, Switzerland, the East and the West Coast of the US. My best answer, favorite answer so far has been from Christopher, who says he's not sure what to expect, because then I'm sure we're not going to let you down. We have a lot to offer this morning. There are people who would learn, who are looking forward to learning about even more APIs to connect to, and I think we might be able to post in some links that may be beneficial for you. Let's see what else. Expectations, hearing more about expectations of the community on APIs from publishers. Sure, we can do that. Looks like Jennifer was a part of the group that discussed this series, and she's looking forward to the panel. This is the very first event in the series, and I'll be making some announcements about what more is to come and what to expect toward the end of this session. Shannon is hoping to hear about the API, about the APIs out there available to us or our customers, and hear about some real use cases. She works at Copyright Clearance Center. More insights on the topic. Of course, this panel will offer that. There is Heather, who is working at Marianne Liber, currently doing more work with API integration in the peer review operations area, and always needing to learn more, like each one of us. Let's see what else. Some people are looking forward to some use cases and practical applications of APIs, also interested in learning from failures. So perhaps our panelists can, focus a little bit on that. Looking forward to learning more about how APIs are used and what new APIs are needed. Oh, that's a gap we can identify. Okay. So yeah, since we only have 60 minutes and I have so many things we have to cover here, let's get started. Let's get started with you, Lisa. I know you're wearing this librarian hat, you're a researcher, you're also a chef and author for the Scholarly Kitchen, and you've been an astute industry watcher. You've been working towards, bringing the series into fruition. So how do you see that libraries can benefit from scholarly APIs? Let's kick off there.
Yeah, so thanks. One of the things that's come back into my sort of thinking in the last couple of years is actually a theory that was developed about library science and published in 1931 by an Indian librarian named S.R. Rescognito. And he proposed 5 laws of library science, the ways that we should understand just the fundamentals of what libraries are about. And I was thinking of this as we were preparing for today's session, because 2 of them I think are so relevant to talking about APIs from this library perspective, which for me is always also the researcher perspective, because that's what libraries are here to do, is to serve learners and scholars, researchers. So he had 2 of his 5 laws. One of them is save the time of the user. That libraries are really a catalyst for efficiency, right? Efficiency in holding collections in common for a collective community, but also by creating pathways and linkages, saving people time. And the other one that I think is very provocative to think about, his 5th law was the library is a growing organism. So metaphorically, we can go a long way with that. But I think the biggest thing I love about that 5th law is that it also says to libraries have to change. They have to evolve, they have to grow. And so I'm thinking of APIs through these 2 lenses. And I see really immense value in APIs for libraries and the user community, as APIs essentially create linkages that fundamentally save a lot of time in many cases, right? It's not that I can't find an article and then go search all the places that it was cited and then call up those articles. But boy, is it a lot easier if I can click on a button that pulls that in, or maybe even just displays it in certain contexts. So the ability to save the time of the user is immense, I think, with APIs. I also think that libraries themselves might be either pushing out APIs to some of our local databases that we offer, but we also then can ingest things into our interfaces and the like. And I've been involved with a lot of projects at the University of Illinois. One that I'm particularly proud of, and I'm only one of a large team, so I'm not the main brain or anything, but we call Easy Search. And it's our main search box on our main search page. And you can actually go there and like do a quick search. And you'll see that in the search results, we're embedding all kinds of additional content, you know, tables of contents, direct links to the PDF, all of that is being driven by APIs. And so this notion of the library as a growing organism, I just look right there and think, this is an amazing example of what it means to push the boundaries of what the library is. So I just really think that this opportunity for linked data, robust data, gives a better researcher experience ultimately, and helps us save people time. And there's nothing more precious in this era than time and attention, right? So those are some of my thoughts as I think about this from a library science perspective.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I love the idea of thinking of library as being an organism, you know, and especially, I think we'll hit this a lot that you said about saving people time. But I want to bring in the researcher perspective, you know, coming in from the library. Dominic, as a researcher, you work with a lot of different data sources and across multiple systems. Do APIs save you time? And what do you look for in an API? What is a good API?
Well, hello. So actually, it's funny that Maria and Nikki are here because we use both ROR and OSF APIs. We use a lot, and I think from a research perspective, both in terms of scholarly text as well as just like scholarly entities, it's kind of hard to answer yes or no about whether APIs save time, because as many of you know from using scholarly like data, it's a lot, especially text. And so oftentimes actually a data dump is preferred. But the interesting thing about that is that a data dump doesn't necessarily have to be separate from an API. So when we talk about APIs or application programming interfaces, we often have an image in our mind of like a public web-based REST style API or OAI MPH. Maybe for some of you will be your first thought, unfortunately. And then, but actually like an API is kind of any interface. And there are like, I haven't seen this in the scholarly API community, but there are a good example for this is like, there's this API for natural language processing called Hugging Face. And it does really well for many things. And I would use it sort of as a good gold standard for what's useful in API. But one thing in particular is it does really well for having to use data sets that are gigabytes or terabytes of data, where there's like just mechanisms for streaming data and so on. That isn't sort of like you have to work with a publisher to set up an FTP server or go to a website and download a zip or something like that. So yeah, a part of the saving time thing is it doesn't really save that much time when you need a large amount of things. So like for Crossref and unpaywall and so on, like it's preferred to have a data dump. And especially because from a researcher perspective or building a scholarly product, oftentimes you need to join various things together. So for instance, like join ROR and GRID and so on. So you can build up affiliation data for authors that are coming from Crossref or OpenAlex, right? So you have this like in a bibliometrics lab or in a scholarly product, you have this like, you want to build up a golden source of truth so you can do your own sort of things. And that's where it doesn't save time. You do want a data dump, and you want it all to yourself, and you want just this ongoing ingestion of this giant source of truth. And in some ways, OpenAlex is doing really good at providing that like sort of unified thing. But then there are certainly times when the APIs definitely save time. So for instance, like it would be really annoying if I had to have like constantly be ingesting dumps of PubMed just so that I could build up like a mappings table from DOIs to PubMed IDs. It's much more preferred to be able to do that on the fly, and that does save a lot of time. And so yeah, it's sort of more, it depends on the use case, but in particular, I just think that like you kind of generally want both, and this goes back to like what makes a good API, and it's kind of, the answer is to make it as boring as possible. So like a lot of scholarly tools use what, as a developer, I would say is non-standard technology, though they would argue that no, it is a standard, and that's what makes it special. It is like for the perfect use case, or perfect case of that is OAI MPH, where like it's not standard for developers, right? And yeah, there are many users and so on, but like it's really annoying and a pain in the ass. But like if it was a REST API, it would be awesome. So if like so a good case of that is like if you have to ingest or work with things like just community run journals and so on, and they're using like OJS, and it doesn't like expose something that's easy to ingest, then you kind of have to tell the community journals like, well, we can't really invest time in ingesting your journal, something like that. So that's where like you really want boring standard technology. And then the other thing is what everyone else will say, which is like documentation is king for APIs. So your API can be kind of crappy, I suppose, as long as you have really good documentation, including not just like this is what each thing does, but also like here's as an introduction, like here's how most people use this, and here's a bunch of different use cases for it. That I find really helpful, especially if like there's code snippets and so on that you could just like copy and paste to get started. And yeah, I think oh, and I'll just say like one thing. I know I've been talking a lot, but one thing that I think is kind of interesting in the API world that you don't see as much for scholarly APIs, but we have this at Scite, which is that an API, like it doesn't have to be just data. So there are these things called like an example of this is like, or data or like functionality. An example of this is web components, where like web components for sure are an API. You wouldn't really think of them as that. So what I'm talking about is like embeddable badges and stuff like, you know, altmetrics badge and dimensions badge and so on. Those are APIs. So the more like we can sort of think about building composable UI elements for APIs, I think that's really interesting and pretty useful. Yeah, again, when you're not from the research side, more from like the product side, when you're sort of like looking at, oh, I want to, I don't know, have this particular feature. Instead of building it, you can sort of embed a little widget.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dominic. So I think we can continue this conversation about, you know, time-saving APIs versus just, you know, APIs that are not time-saving. And to all the audience out there, if you want to make your API successful, make them boring. I think that's the message I got, Dominic. It's good to have standards. It's great to have documentation. And I am assuming these web components are not boring because I use them all the time and they're pretty exciting, but they serve the needs. So we'll get back to that. And I request all the attendees to post their questions in Q&A. There's a lot going on here in the chat, so we may not be able to capture your questions from there adequately. And Dominic, thanks for mentioning that you've been using a lot of ROR and OSF APIs. So Nikki, I want to turn to you next. OSF uses API in many ways, right? They both consuming other APIs and pushing out your own APIs. Can you tell us a little bit more about your strategy and the work you do to make APIs usable by folks like Dominic?
Sure, I'd love to. And yeah, I think that's exciting. It's really exciting to have a boring API, but the excitement really falls in the use cases and the opportunities to leverage that to do so many time-saving and cool things. So we see the use of standardized APIs as critical to advancing knowledge because it creates that connection between systems and enables interoperability of research. And the best way to kind of illustrate that, I think, is through some examples. So just talking about the OSF specifically, it's built as a single page application, which uses an API to render the data in the interface on OSF, but the same API that talks to the OSF front end also stands alone. We actually like to think about it as its own product, and it can talk to many other interfaces to send and receive data to help researchers efficiently collaborate, manage, and share their research across the research lifecycle. So for example, we talk about more of the active parts of the research lifecycle, less about some of the end stage discovery workflows, although we support those too. But OSF allows researchers to set up a project space, and that can be private or public, and connect other tools to help manage their research. So tools like Google Drive, OneDrive, S3, OwnCloud, Box, Dropbox, those are all tools that integrate using APIs and work with OSF, and it helps them just manage their files, collaborate on their research, plan their research, but also tools like GitHub and GitLab are integrated with OSF to help manage code and scripts for additional analysis potentially. Also citations. So we have the Mendeley and Zotero APIs connected with OSF to support that aspect of research. And then also research outputs and data on Figshare and Dataverse can directly integrate with your OSF project. So the API creates asynchronous connections with those tools to enable greater efficiency, time saving, as we were talking about before, for researchers. A couple other examples, because those are pretty straightforward that you may not think about. So institutional users can use our API and the InCommon API for their identity management to create their accounts and log into OSF without having to create yet another account and password. You can manage all of that. And the same with ORCID. So creating accounts using the ORCID API on the OSF, just think about the time saving and the sort of overhead of managing those accounts and passwords. It also then supports some of the ROR ID updates that Maria will get to in a minute, but asynchronously auto updating those other profiles in ORCID or ROR with the same metadata information that the APIs are passing back and forth. Researchers may not even realize this is happening on their behalf, which is really the beauty of it all. Additionally, we've had other tools use our open API and pretty great documentation to build those connections with OSF without our involvement. So protocols.io actually released an integration with OSF that they completely did on their own, which is an amazing feat, I think, to have those protocols that researchers create be able to push directly into their OSF projects. There's other clients built on top of the OSF. So like I said, the OSF API has an interface called the OSF, osf.io, but there are other interfaces, clients that work with the API to support researchers needing to push data directly to the OSF from their instrumentation. So they don't necessarily need to go to the OSF interface. They can directly, using the API, send their data or pull their data out of the OSF and pull it into R packages and do additional analysis. Also thinking about what I'm sure other people are talking about and thinking about as far as sending metadata for those discovery workflows. APIs with Crossref and DataSeerAI are the obvious ones that sync up, but we know those are leveraged in so many additional workflows. So just knowing that OSF data and metadata is shared in those contexts then allows for additional workflows beyond that. So really, I think APIs, I would call them like the best friends of researchers and research stakeholders, because it really means that they can upload or enter information once, and that can be sent or interoperated everywhere without duplication of that effort. And often without the researcher really needing to do anything additional to make sure that those workflows are supported downstream when they need them. And I think that just as a note to some of what Dominic was mentioning, there are different types of APIs to look out for. Some are fully open and free to access, like the OSF, while others might have restricted access to some aspects or have thresholds on what you can take. Because he was talking about trying to get everything out of an API at one time could be problematic for those systems. So having some restrictions sometimes are a good thing. And then some may even have further access limitations to data or metadata that would be available maybe with a fee or subscription model. But hopefully that helps illustrate some of the things that both Lisa and Dominic mentioned about saving time. And I like to think of maybe not an organism, but the backbone, I think, of a lot of research is happening through API activities.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Nikki. I love the fact that you want to make things easier for researchers, and it would be time, APIs would be time saving in that respect for sure. And I would go back to saying that libraries are an organism with a backbone. So, and I love the fact that you mentioned about metadata, because that sort of takes me to you, Maria. I can't help but think, about how important metadata and identifiers are in the scholarly API ecosystem. And that's something we haven't really touched upon so much so far. So can you please tell us about some of your work and how it continues to be a vibrant data ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks. I think everyone has kind of set things up nicely to get to this point to talk about APIs and how they work with metadata and persistent identifiers. That I think these metaphors of best friends and backbones ring true in this case very nicely as well. So I think ROR is a good example of how persistent identifiers and the rich metadata that can be associated with them are a really key part of how we build connections across the scholarly API ecosystem. So just to say a little bit more about ROR for people who may be less familiar, as I mentioned, ROR provides an open registry of identifiers for institutional affiliations, and we make that data we make those IDs and then the metadata associated with the IDs available as a completely open CC0 data set and via public API that anyone can access. And we also have a data dump that we make available, and I'll pick up on what Dom said about API versus data dump in a moment, because there's some interesting nuances there to tease out. So ROR doesn't just offer and have an API, but it's also designed to be used in conjunction with other APIs, and that's really where the power is. So we have a unique ID for each organization that's in ROR. We have metadata about each organization that helps with additional discovery and disambiguation, like information about where the organization is located, what its URL is, and then crosswalks as well to other kinds of identifiers that also exist for the organization like IDs for the same organization in the Crossref funder registry or in Wikidata. And so what we're really trying to do with the ROR API and with ROR in general is to really help mitigate data quality issues in scholarly communication systems by providing this standard identifier that can be used instead of a text string that might be written any number of different ways, like, you know, UC Berkeley versus University of California, Berkeley. So I think this, you know, the ability to have a standard and unique identifier as a stable reference point that can be shared and connected through APIs is really where the power of ROR comes in. So it's really not just about, you know, ROR existing to be an identifier. It's really about making all of our workflows more efficient and more interconnected, and saving researchers time, saving research administrators time, saving a bunch of people's time, and supporting better data quality issues overall, because we're not repeating the same information in multiple places. So just to give an example of how the ROR API might work in practice, you know, let's say you're a researcher submitting a paper in a manuscript submission system that's hooked up to the ROR API, and you get to that point in the process where you're asked to enter your affiliation, and you might start typing your affiliation in the box. And if the system is not connected to any sort of API or standard data source, you can just write whatever you want in that box and, you know, make up the name of your university or whatever affiliation. But let's say that field is actually connected to the ROR API and makes a call in the background. You don't know that's going on. You're then presented with some predictive results that are based on ROR's controlled list that you can select from. And so what the system is getting is a standard and consistent affiliation instead of just a text string that's up to however the person writes it. And you as the user aren't necessarily doing any extra work or don't have to know or go to ROR separately to look up what your ROR ID happens to be. But let's take that a step further, and let's say, you know, that system is actually integrated with ORCID, and ORCID is integrated with ROR and has ROR's affiliations in the ORCID profiles. And so you could be submitting, this is sort of ideal thinking, you could be submitting that paper, and through the connections to the ORCID API, that system can actually populate your affiliation information based on ROR by leveraging the ORCID API. So that saves even more time and supports even better data quality overall. So then later on down the process, let's say that research gets published, the research gets registered with the DOI, and then the metadata that's part of that DOI can include the ROR ID for the researcher's affiliation, can include the ORCID ID, other identifiers, and other rich metadata. And so all of those connections happen through connecting persistent identifiers and the metadata that's associated with them, and all of that passing and sharing of information really happens through open APIs, and especially by leveraging the open metadata that's associated with those identifiers. And so then if you're, you know, a research administrator or a librarian, or trying to, you know, pull some sort of report or tracking of, you know, how do I find all of the research associated with UC Berkeley, for instance, we can, you know, more easily get consistent and useful information downstream by leveraging the Crossref API to pull that information and things like that. So it really comes back to that notion of backbone, or, you know, the plumbing, or whatever kind of metaphor you want to think about how APIs and persistent identifiers and metadata really work together to, you know, to stitch things together in the background and make these connections possible, to share information, to make sure that information is clean and consistent, and to save everyone time. So they work better when they work together. They work better when they're as open as possible.
Wonderful. As you've been saying things, I had been thinking about a community of APIs, and I think we're getting a lot of chat discussions and questions from folks, and I think it sort of may evolve into something like that. But I would like to encourage all attendees to please start posting questions in Q&A. I'm trying to capture your questions from the chat, but the chat has been a little busy. So I want to kickstart the attendee questions by giving each one of you a minute, perhaps, to speak. We will begin with the first set of questions, which is, are there best practices for how APIs are designed? And how do you even start with APIs? Any advice for the starters? How about Dom, you go first?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many best practices that are all different for how APIs are designed, but there's generally a few, I think, that people sort of latch onto. And one is there's a typical design called a RESTful design, which you've probably seen over and over, which is basically like you can access it through the web. You know, it's kind of, again, boring things. And there's like an identifier for an entity. So say in the case of ROAR, it's like an affiliation, and you can access that by listing affiliations, or you can sort of select one by an identifier, and so on. So that's like what a RESTful design is. And then sort of, but then, you know, there are, of course, GraphQL and OAI MPH for us, and those are different, and they wouldn't sort of have that. But yeah, the best practices, like there's tons of guides online that are, a lot of them are focusing really on sort of user-facing things like documentation, providing client libraries, and so on. And yeah, about like how to get started using APIs. I think in our case, like a lot of groups provide really great ways to start. Like I'll just call it like both OpenAlex and Crossref, where a good way to start with those is that you can just use like the web interface, and it's like very similar to the API. And so if you have like a particular use case, like say you want to, I don't know, say you want to get the preprints of a particular publication, well, you can do that with Crossref. So you could just like look at publications that you're interested in getting preprints of, and you can search them in Crossref, and you can like see the JSON file. And so that's sounds maybe a bit complicated, but essentially it's like just a data that lists all the things that's part of it, and then there's a field that shows like the preprints for paper if it's available. And so that would be like, I think just exploring those manually is the first step, and then it sort of goes on from there. So then, you know, okay, well, if you want to use an API programmatically, which is sort of what they're designed for, then you have to sort of have a tool that processes JSON. So you're going to need there unfortunately isn't sort of like that step is kind of like stepping off a cliff if you're not a developer. So there isn't really an easy way to, if you don't know how to program, to use like an API programmatically, unfortunately. Maybe others know of other tools.
Dom, I would say that you are a researcher, so nothing's too complex for you. So the idea is to break down things and then handle, you know, in bite sizes, and nothing is too complex. And to your second part, I want to say there is going to be a subsequent event in this series where folks who do not have technical background would learn to use APIs and even design. So it's not beyond your reach, and I'll be announcing a little bit more details about that. But I want to give an opportunity to all panelists to answer this question. Maybe we'll go to Lisa next, then Nikki and Maria in that order. Lisa.
Well, I put this in the chat, but I think I'll say it out loud here too, since I kicked off this sort of like save the time, right? So just to be clear, I don't think this is necessary. I think this actually saving users time takes a lot of other people's time, right? And so there is a need to work through connecting these. Although I also want to point out, like in my experience as an OSF end user, it's also clear that once APIs exist, then service providers can make it easier for the non-technical among us to sort of benefit from the technical capacities of those by sort of putting a more end user interface in front of them. So, you know, could I make my Dropbox files show up on a website? No. Can I use the OSF interface to make that happen? Yes. So I think, you know, that's one of the things to think about too, which is the layering that happens here, which I think, though, I'm just going to go back to the whole point of having an API is only one part of the package that has to be delivered, because we were talking before about documentation. So it's documentation for people who are going to use the API, especially since in many cases, they're going to use that to represent data to an end user. And that active representation has a pretty big ethical obligation with it too, right? Because you're taking data from one context and presenting it in another and making sure that there's no erroneous, well, obviously you want the data to be accurate, but it's also the context that helps someone make sense of what they're seeing. I think that's one thing that we have to really work on as well, is making sure that when we translate these to end users who are seeing the results of API integrations, that the integration isn't just integrating the data, but is also accurately and usefully representing the data in context in a way that's understandable and isn't misleading.
Nikki?
I would agree with what Dominic and Lisa shared. I have nothing really to add on best practices. I think they nailed the majority of them. The only thing I posted was Postman, which is actually a tool out there that you can use for free that should help anybody who's just getting started working with APIs. I know that's how I started. It actually, when we were developing the OSF API the first time around, this is how I would support QA testing and understanding how it was working, because it would do some things in the interface, but you could do so much more with the API itself. And so, as Lisa was just talking about, the use of it for the platform is really, you know, validating its efficacy, but there's so much more actually that can be done with APIs. I don't think we've fully scratched the surface of some of that. So that would be the other thing, I think, to just build on. Community groups that really focus on this would be an amazing thing to start with.
And this is going to be a spoiler alert, but the Scholarly API 101 event that is to follow this event will actually use some API basics in the Postman API platform. So stay tuned for more details. Maria, over to you.
Yeah, I think just to echo a lot of what has already been said, I think it's definitely great to be interrogating a bit more this notion of, you know, whose time are we saving, and what does it mean to really save time? And so I think drawing out some of those nuances of, as people have said about, you know, it's not just about, you know, saving the user's time, but it's really about the kinds of, because in some cases it's not true that we're saving our own time, but it's really about how APIs and this kind of connectivity can enable more, you know, more powerful and enriching connections that make our you know, all of the work that we do more meaningful and significant in various ways. But yeah, I guess I'm just kind of repeating what other people have said. I think that, you know, there's definitely a need for additional training and resources, I would say, to equip more people with the, you know, kind of getting started with APIs or being less intimidated. I think Postman is a great tool. There are some courses and trainings like through the Force 11 Scholarly Communication Training Institute, and you know, through the kind of training that organizations like the Carpentries do to kind of bring, you know, less technical people into the fold to become equipped to work with APIs. I think that there's so much potential to do more with that, and I would love to see that as a growing trend. You know, to have, you know, API training, you know, be more part of like library school curriculum. Like, it's definitely something that I never learned about in library school, and it's a big part of the work that I do now. So yeah, I think there's some great, you know, great ideas being raised here on, you know, on how to, you know, how to lift everybody up and how to get more people engaged and involved. But there are definitely different types of users to be aware of, you know, like especially with ROAR, we have a broad, very broadly and actively engaged community, and we have, you know, super, you know, power users who, you know, they just go ahead and they start working with the ROAR API or the ROAR data dump, and we don't ever really hear about it because they're very self-sufficient and able to just kind of, you know, pick up on the data and start doing cool things with it, like building ROAR into OpenAlex or building ROAR into scite and things like that. And then there are other people who need a little bit more guidance and need a little bit more hand-holding to get up to speed. And so we're constantly kind of, trying to serve both of those needs to bring everybody along and to, find ways for, in this case, ROAR to be useful to a wide range of purposes and skill sets.
Yeah, I'll definitely be in the second category, I'll needing a little bit more hand-holding. That's why I'm looking forward to this series, which is actually going to be very uplifting for everyone and fill the void of really upskilling us as needed. And Maria, since I have you, I have a couple of questions on ROR. People are saying it sounds like Ringgold. Is that an inaccurate comparison? And how many publishers are adopting to ROR? And what do you think ROR advantages are over Ringgold?
Sure, yes, I think I addressed the Ringgold question in the Q&A. So my answer should have posted there. But to briefly summarize and kind of, I don't want to stray too much from the API topic, both Ringgold and ROAR are unique identifiers for institutions, and ROAR is distinct in that it's completely open, it's free to use, the API is completely open. ROAR is specifically focused on capturing top level affiliations and also on, playing well and fitting into other existing infrastructures for scholarly communications, like being supported in cross-ref metadata for DOIs and in ORCID records and things like that. So publisher integrations with ROAR is kind of a growing area now that ROAR IDs are supported in cross-ref. And so there are a few cross-ref people hanging out in the chat who can who may want to speak more to that, but I don't have a specific number off the top of my head because there are a number of different integrations that are in process, but eLife is a recent example of a publisher that started integrating with ROAR, and there are a number of others in the pipeline.
Yeah, I'm very thankful to all the attendees for all the questions they're posting. They're all great questions, and I'm going to randomly pick question, and one question sort of struck me because I think a lot about equity and diversity. And this question is from Jay Patel. How do we make sure that access to APIs and the resulting output from APIs is accessible to researchers and publishers in the global South? Lisa?
So, I mean, there's so many layers there, right? So researchers benefiting from data that gets integrated, like when ROAR is integrated into an open access platform, like there's no problem with anyone, benefiting from the impact of that API's integration into an OA published platform, right? So I'm going to take the spirit of the question rather than the literal, right? So which is, we're going to see once it comes to APIs that you have to pay for, or where certain skill levels are needed. And so you have to have certain educational levels or training available, like all those things are going to exist in this arena, just like they exist in any other arena. So I think it's, we're continuously grappling with what is made available for free, what is under some sort of metered accessibility, and then what is fee-based. And, things that are fee-based because even nonprofits, right, that, have fee-based services because it's the only way to offer that service. And so it's just going to be the same grappling we see across the rest of the industry. So I don't think APIs are a panacea here. They're not going to solve all this problem. They might help equalize access and benefits and value creation in certain areas. But scholarly APIs include proprietary APIs you have to pay for, and that only get integrated into proprietary platforms that you have to pay for. So I'm kind of struggling with it as an actual like making the APIs results, et cetera, available is about actually making the whole system available. So, but I'm wondering if with Dominic, working with scite, which is a platform that has, if I understand correctly, kind of has this some is free, some you pay for model. And so how have you built that into your business model to sort of see, are there waivers available for low and middle income countries? Is there a different fee structure? What is done, like, in even though?
Oh, sorry, it paused for a second. But I think I got your question. Yeah, I mean, I think like none of this really has to do with the API, because our API is like open and publicly available and so on. And the restrictions are more around our agreements with publishers and what we're allowed to show, rather than sort of business related concerns. But I would say that, like, yeah, certainly the way we look at it is is it frozen still?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. I thought it was frozen. Okay, yeah, I would say, okay, so I'll make it short. Essentially, we work with resellers who work in different regions, and we just trust them to make like the pricing and packaging and so on sensitive to different regions. But that's kind of a bit more boring. It doesn't touch the API side. There are very interesting things, I think, in the scholarly API world that we can sort of talk about for what Jay's saying as the global south, which is in the scholarly world, like you would think, or sorry, in the API world, for making it globally accessible, oftentimes people talk about translation and making things multilingual, but fortunately or unfortunately, like English is sort of a prerequisite for engaging in any type of scholarship. And so we don't really have the same kind of like translation burden often. That's not always true. There's like huge Chinese and Turkish scholarship centers that are published in their own language, for instance. But one thing, a list of things you wouldn't expect, but that we do to ensure that our API is like accessible for researchers, is things like we use a content delivery network that is globally available, so that when you use our API, it isn't like you're using a server that's located in like Montreal or in Oregon, right? You're using from a network where you can access it and the network's local to you. And that's a thing you wouldn't expect, but if you have APIs that are like centralized in Montreal or Oregon, right, then you will have latency for researchers in China that could be really high. And so that's like one way to make things accessible, or think about it accessibly, is just to make delivery times performant across the world. We work with researchers all over the world using our data and API, and I think that's probably the biggest thing of making it accessible. Yeah.
I agree with you, Dom, and I think we may have to dedicate a whole session to this and the issue of sustainability and the power that we are using in creating APIs and how to make that equitable. But I do want to take a question here, which is regarding the libraries, and the ladies perhaps can, allude to that. What are some of the main challenges a library faces when interested in utilizing an API to save time for the user? Lisa, maybe you could speak in relation to creating that easy search, or Maria in relation to embedding ROR at submission, and Nikki perhaps from the perspective of integrating different APIs.
So, sort of, I bet the answers are very similar. First is somebody who has the skill set to make it happen, like literally the technology skill set. Secondly is going to be awareness of an API that can do the thing we'd like to see done. So even when they exist, we're not always aware of them. And then thirdly, for some of them, these are fee-based services. So we need money in order to subscribe to them, in order to integrate the API from that service. So the API may be free, but if the API points to content that you only can access if you have a subscription to that content, we have to have the content. So let's see, that comes down to skills, knowledge, money. I guess we could say time. We'll add time to that just to round out. So, but I think for libraries in particular, since I did see the question in the Q&A, I think our biggest challenge is actually having people on staff who have the skill sets to make this happen. And then I might add an extra one, which is also the strategic vision for understanding which ones to incorporate where and when. When will we actually save the time of the user by investing our time? So it's not just a matter of using every API that comes along. It's also a matter of having a strategy. I actually wrote a piece on the Scholarly Kitchen called Discovery Should Be Delivery, in which I articulated and shared with the community the sort of touch point principles that we use in developing easy search. And those same principles would apply then in sort of like how we assess whether integrating certain things is a valuable thing for easy search per se, which, as I said, is our single search box on our main library homepage. So I don't know, I mean, Nikki and Maria or others, like, what do you see as, I know you both probably work with libraries, right? So when your library partners come to use your APIs, what makes a library more successful in being able to benefit from these APIs?
Yeah, and we're almost on the top of the hour here, approaching it. So Nikki, would you like to go first? And Lisa, could you please share the link to that TSK post here in the chat for all of us? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to one kind of relevant issue that we're actively kind of trying to support, which is some of these new policies coming from funders talking about data sharing requirements. And so this is an area where I think we actually need to look at this as a collective community and decide how do we need to support that. Obviously, being able to have ROR and funder IDs affiliated with the research that's coming out from researchers is something that if we had those things in place, then the APIs from different systems would enable institutions and funders to make sure that they're kind of being consistent and compliant with those new requirements. So to me, that's one where I think there's a relevant issue. We're going to all need to sort of look at it together and find the solutions. I think the solutions are in place, but have we really looked at it to say this is how these pieces would fit together to support this workflow in this use case? And I think that's actually maybe a topic we could put on the list for another part of the series, just because it's so relevant and the pressure is going to continue to increase as that date in January approaches for at least the NIH policy change.
Maria, would you want to add anything more just within a minute?
Well, I think plus one to Lisa and Nikki on all of that. I think ROR is in a slightly different situation because we're not necessarily working with libraries per se to say, integrate ROR right now, but it's really about, as I see it, it's about, the key is about awareness and knowledge of where ROR might be a useful thing in other systems that libraries are using or considering using, and to be able to have that kind of information for decision-making purposes or budgeting purposes to understand what the implications might be of like working with a system that uses ROR for affiliations versus another identifier and things like that. So in addition to, everything that Lisa and Nikki said, I just wanted to point that out, that there's a sort of evaluation aspect or decision-making aspect in terms of what I see being really valuable for libraries in this area.
And that's a key point. Thank you so much for adding that insight. Well, this has been so terrific, and I want to just keep going on, but we are about at time. So before we conclude the session, I did want to thank all the panelists for sharing these wonderful insights and getting us all pumped up about this series that's upcoming. For the attendees, we surely hope you found this first session of the Scholarly API series valuable. This session has been recorded and the link will be shared on the ConTech Live social media page. So please go back and revisit it and share it with your friends and colleagues. As I promised, next in our series is a Scholarly API 101 event to learn some API basics in the Postman API platform that all our panelists have been raving about and a lot of attendees. No previous knowledge of programming or code is required. It's just an opportunity to have fun and advance your understanding of what APIs can be made to do. So I'll be joining you as an attendee there. The 101 event will be followed by an explorathon, which I'm not sure what that is, and individual events like today's webinar that will each focus on different directions for the use of scholarly APIs. So please keep an eye out for the announcements from ConTech Live, not only for these updates, but also for some other exciting events that they run throughout the year. And once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you all the panelists for sharing your insights this morning. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.